put your phone or device aside and immerse yourself in this audio story. Perfect for listening on the move, while relaxing, or for bedtime listening. We release new stories daily, so make sure to like and subscribe to not miss out. This story is based on true events. The building that swallowed $74 billion. In the autumn of 2001, a building stood empty in downtown Houston. Inside, the lights still burned, floor after floor of abandoned desks, computers left running, coffee cups half full. It looked like everyone had simply vanished. But they hadn't vanished. They'd fled. And in their wake, $74 billion had evaporated into thin air. This wasn't a heist. This wasn't a market crash. This was something far more sinister. A deception so elaborate, so perfectly constructed, that it fooled the smartest minds on Wall Street, the most prestigious auditors in the world, and thousands of employees who believed they were building the future. Welcome to the dark side of business, where America's most innovative company was actually America's most sophisticated lie. This is the story of Enron, and how an empire of fraud was built in plain sight. The year was 1985. Kenneth Lay, a PhD economist with the smooth demeanor of a preacher and the ambition of a conqueror, merged two struggling pipeline companies to create Enron. On paper, it was unremarkable. A natural gas company in Houston, nothing more. But Lay saw something others didn't. The energy market was being deregulated. And in that chaos, he saw opportunity, not just to profit, but to dominate. He envisioned Enron not as a pipeline company, but as a trading powerhouse, buying and selling energy like it was currency. It was brilliant. It was revolutionary. And it worked. By the mid-1990s, Enron had transformed itself. No longer just pipelines and power plants. They were trading everything. Electricity, natural gas, water rights, even bandwidth and weather derivatives. They'd created entire markets where none existed before. Wall Street was mesmerized. Fortune magazine named them America's most innovative company 6 years in a row. Their stock price soared from $13 in 1990 to $90 by 2000. Employees became millionaires on paper. The company's gleaming headquarters became a symbol of the new economy. Smart, aggressive, unstoppable. But behind the marble facades and the champagne celebrations, something darker was taking root. In 1996, Kenneth Lay made a decision that would seal Enron's fate. He hired Jeffrey Skilling as president and chief operating officer. Skilling was a Harvard MBA, a former McKinsey consultant, and a man who believed that intelligence justified everything. He was brilliant, arrogant, and utterly ruthless. He looked at traditional business models with contempt. "We don't want to be an energy company," he told his executives. "We want to be the smartest guys in the room." And he meant it. Skilling implemented a corporate culture built on Darwinian principles. The weak were culled, the strong rewarded beyond measure. Every 6 months, employees were ranked. The bottom 15% were fired, no matter how well the company performed. It created an environment of paranoia, backstabbing, and moral flexibility. If you wanted to survive at Enron, you learned to bend the rules. You learned to hide problems. You learned to lie. But Skilling's most dangerous innovation wasn't his corporate culture. It was an accounting method called mark-to-market. With the SEC's approval, Enron began booking projected future profits from long-term contracts immediately, the day the deal was signed. Build a power plant that would generate revenue over 20 years. Book all 20 years of estimated profits today. Sign a contract to deliver natural gas for a decade. Record a decade of profit right now. On paper, it was innovative financial engineering. In reality, it was a license to fabricate success. Because those projected profits weren't real. They were guesses, estimates, fantasies. And when reality didn't match the fantasy, when a power plant underperformed or a contract went bad. Enron didn't revise their numbers. They hid the losses. That's where Andrew Fastow entered the story. Enron's chief financial officer, Fastow was a master of financial manipulation, a man who could make debt disappear and losses vanish with the stroke of a pen. He created something that would become Enron's most dangerous weapon, a labyrinth of special-purpose entities, hundreds of off-balance sheet partnerships with names like Chuco, LJM, and Raptor. These weren't real companies. They were financial ghosts, shadow corporations designed to hide Enron's mounting debts and failing investments. Here's how it worked. When an Enron venture failed, and many did, the losses would be transferred to these shell companies. Enron's books stayed clean, profitable, pristine. The debt simply vanished into the shadows. And Fastow didn't just manage these entities. He personally profited from them, making tens of millions in fees and transactions that represented a staggering conflict of interest. The board knew. They approved it anyway. By 2000, Enron looked unstoppable from the outside. The stock hit its all-time high of $90 per share. The company was valued at over $70 billion. Kenneth Lay was friends with presidents. Jeffrey Skilling appeared on the covers of business magazines as the visionary CEO. Employees had their entire retirement savings, their 401ks, locked in Enron stock, believing they were investing in the future. But inside the building, a handful of people knew the truth. The company was hemorrhaging money. Real money, not the fantasy profits in their reports. Projects in India, Brazil, and elsewhere were catastrophic failures, losing billions. Enron's broadband division, trumpeted as the next frontier, was a disaster. The energy trading that had made them famous was being propped up by fraud. And those special-purpose entities, they were ticking time bombs, stuffed with toxic assets and guaranteed by Enron stock itself. If the stock price fell, the whole structure would collapse. It was a house of cards built on quicksand, and the foundation was already cracking. Then came the first hook, the moment when the facade began to crumble. In August 2001, Jeffrey Skilling abruptly resigned as CEO after only 6 months in the role. He gave vague reasons, personal issues, wanting to spend time with family. But people who knew him understood. Skilling saw what was coming, and he was running. Kenneth Lay reassumed the CEO position, telling investors everything was fine, that Enron had never been stronger. But behind closed doors, Lay was selling his own stock, millions of dollars worth, while encouraging employees to keep buying. This is the dark heart of corporate greed. The executives knew the ship was sinking, and they were the only ones grabbing lifeboats. Meanwhile, rank-and-file employees watched their retirement accounts, locked in Enron stock during a blackout period, become worthless as the stock began its death spiral. They couldn't sell. They could only watch. On August 14, 2001, a mid-level executive named Sharon Watkins did something that would make her infamous. She wrote an anonymous letter to Kenneth Lay warning that Enron would implode in a wave of accounting scandals. She detailed the off-balance sheet partnerships, the hidden losses, the accounting fraud. "I am incredibly nervous that we will implode in a wave of accounting scandals," she wrote. Lay met with her personally. He promised to investigate. But instead of launching a real investigation, Enron's lawyers asked whether they could fire Watkins. The answer was no. It would look suspicious. So they did nothing. The warnings were ignored. The fraud continued. And the clock was ticking. Throughout September and October 2001, Wall Street analysts began asking uncomfortable questions. Enron's financial statements were impenetrably complex, thousands of pages of dense accounting jargon that didn't quite add up. A reporter named Bethany McLean published an article in Fortune magazine asking a simple question. How exactly does Enron make its money? No one could answer. During a conference call, when an analyst pressed Jeffrey Skilling on the company's opaque finances, Skilling called him an asshole on a recorded line. The mask was slipping. Short sellers began circling, betting billions that Enron's stock would collapse. They smelled blood in the water. On October 16, 2001, Enron announced a $618 million loss, its first quarterly loss in years. But buried in the announcement was something far more disturbing, a $1.2 billion reduction in shareholder equity related to those mysterious partnerships run by Andrew Fastow. The stock plummeted. Investors panicked. The SEC launched an investigation. And then, in a desperate attempt to stop the bleeding, Enron fired Andrew Fastow. But it was too late. The partnerships were unwinding, the debts were surfacing, and the truth was finally clawing its way into the light. Now comes the second hook, the revelation that made the Enron scandal not just a business failure, but a crime that shook America's faith in capitalism itself. As investigators dug deeper, they discovered that Enron's auditor, Arthur Andersen, one of the Big Five accounting firms, hadn't just failed to catch the fraud. They had helped perpetrate it. Andersen had blessed Enron's fraudulent accounting, signed off on the special purpose entities, and looked the other way as billions in losses were hidden. Why? Because Enron was paying them $52 million a year, $27 million for consulting, $25 million for auditing. Arthur Andersen wasn't just Enron's watchdog. They were Enron's accomplice. And when the SEC investigation began, Andersen employees did something that would seal their firm's destruction. They shredded documents. Tons of them. Trucks full of shredded paper left the Andersen offices in Houston. It was obstruction of justice on a massive scale, and it would bring down a 90-year-old institution. By November 2001, Enron was in free fall. The stock that had traded at $90 a year earlier was now under $10. Credit rating agencies, who had mysteriously kept Enron at investment grade until the very end, suddenly downgraded the company to junk status. Trading partners fled. Banks called in their loans. Dinergy, a smaller energy company, briefly considered buying Enron, but when they looked at the books, really looked, they discovered the losses were far worse than anyone imagined. They walked away. Enron was alone, circling the drain, with nowhere left to hide. On December 2, 2001, Enron filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. At the time, it was the largest corporate bankruptcy in American history. $74 billion in market value. Gone. 4,000 employees lost their jobs overnight. Many lost everything: their salaries, their health insurance, and their retirement savings, which had been locked in now worthless Enron stock. Executives who had known the truth and sold their shares early walked away with hundreds of millions. Kenneth Lay had sold over $300 million in stock while telling employees to keep buying. Jeffrey Skilling had cashed out over $66 million before he resigned. Andrew Fastow had made over $45 million from his illegal partnerships. While employees saw their life savings evaporate, the architects of the fraud had already secured their fortunes. It was theft masquerading as business, and the scale of the betrayal was breathtaking. The aftermath was seismic. Federal prosecutors launched a massive criminal investigation. Arthur Andersen was indicted for obstruction of justice and convicted in 2002, effectively destroying the firm and putting 85,000 people out of work worldwide. Congress passed the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, the most sweeping corporate governance reform since the Great Depression, forcing CEOs to personally certify their financial statements under penalty of prison. And one by one, the Enron executives faced justice. Andrew Fastow pleaded guilty to fraud and served 6 years in prison. Jeffrey Skilling was convicted on 19 counts of conspiracy, fraud, and insider trading, and sentenced to 24 years, later reduced to 14. Kenneth Lay was convicted on 10 counts of fraud and conspiracy, but he died of a heart attack before sentencing, taking his secrets to the grave. But the real victims weren't the executives. They were the thousands of employees who believed in the company, who worked long hours and invested their futures in what they thought was America's most innovative enterprise. Retirees who had planned to live on their Enron pensions found themselves with nothing. Families lost their homes. People who had dedicated decades to the company were left with worthless stock certificates and shattered dreams. The psychological toll was devastating. Some Enron employees never recovered, their faith in the system destroyed by the people they had trusted most. So what lessons does this dark business story hold? First, complexity is often a weapon. Enron's financial statements were so deliberately opaque that even sophisticated investors couldn't understand them. When a company can't explain how it makes money in simple terms, that's a red flag screaming fraud. Second, culture matters more than strategy. Enron's culture of ruthless competition and moral flexibility didn't just permit fraud. It encouraged it, rewarded it, made it necessary for survival. Third, conflicts of interest are poison. When your auditor is also your consultant, when your CFO profits from your partnerships, when your board approves obvious corruption, the system has failed. And finally, unchecked ambition is dangerous. Enron's executives weren't content with success. They needed to be the smartest, the most innovative, the most admired. That hunger for greatness, unmoored from ethics, led them to build an empire of lies. The Enron scandal remains a defining moment in American capitalism, a stark reminder that markets require more than just innovation and ambition. They require truth, transparency, and accountability. Without those foundations, even the most impressive edifice is just a beautiful facade hiding rot and decay. Enron's towers still stand in Houston, now occupied by other companies, the name scrubbed from the buildings like a curse that needed exorcising. But the lessons remain, carved into the memory of everyone who watched $74 billion disappear, dissolved by greed, destroyed by lies. And if you ever find yourself in a company that values winning over integrity, that punishes questions and rewards silence, that makes simple things complex and hides the truth behind jargon, remember Enron. Remember the abandoned desks and the shredded documents. Remember the employees who lost everything while executives counted their millions. Because the dark side of business isn't just about criminals and scandals. It's about what happens when smart people convince themselves that the rules don't apply, that the ends justify the means, that they can outsmart consequence itself. Enron proved them wrong, and in the end, the only thing that disappeared faster than their $74 billion was their belief that they would never get caught. Subscribe and listen to our next story below.